my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel Springboard Thought. Today I'm doing the last weekly reads for January 2021. Have read more than the usual. I've read 20 books, but owing to the fact that my gaming group canceled both Saturdays, gave me a lot more time, and then you'll see that a bunch of these will be quite quick because they're just comic book omnibuses. The first book that I consumed was on audio, Fault Lines by Emily Itami. This was really great. I gave it 4 stars. It's a lot more about theme than anything else. She's going through a crisis of identity. She has 2 kids. She has a partner. They live in Japan, and they're just sort of like in this pattern in which they're not communicating very much. So there's this great kind of chasm between them, I would say. And one day she comes upon a random guy that may or may not be hitting on her. He gives her her number. She starts spending time with this guy as a way to do like literally anything else other than mothering her kids. And there's a weird sort of relationship that forms, which is both like an intimacy steeped in like platonic ideals that begins to shift somewhat. And the fault lines are reflected in the fact that everybody in Japan is like, or at least these people are terrified of earthquakes. And yet, after sort of catastrophic events occur in this woman's life, including physical events like an earthquake, there's a sort of rejiggering of selfhood, and she reassesses where she is at. And so it's not so much about whether she like hooks up with this guy or not, although it is somewhat at a plot standpoint about that, or even whether the relationship between the husband and her will be repaired or not, although it is about that as well somewhat. It's more about this sort of broader sense and thematic points that is being drawn between fault lines in a physical manifestation and at a systemic level of society, selfhood, and catastrophic events, basically. So I found it very captivating, very interesting. It's very short. The narration was very good. It goes into narration of when she was a kid, so her entering a new phase of her life, possibly with this new friend, makes her spiral into her past and kind of figure out what happened to her. Yeah, I would recommend it. I liked it quite a bit. World of Black Hammer Library Editions, Volume 2 and 3, which are oversized. I've showed these before. The second one was very underwhelming. I gave it 3 stars, just kind of passable. It was a World War II reimagining people of color in one group doing all these different missions. Military war fiction I truly just cannot give a shit about. The next story after that was pretty good, and the whole collection was just ended up being middling. The next one though was fantastic. I gave it 5 stars. This is the one where it is Captain Weird's origin story essentially, and then after that another sort of like micro almost origin story of Barbalian, and it's like paralleling a queer story. He is actually canonically queer and a gay man. It takes place in the 90s AIDS pandemic, where he is masquerading as a police officer because he thinks, you know, about justice and systemic issues and making change from within. And it's him meeting another person who has a different perspective. And so his like queer story is paralleled by his actually being an alien, and it kind of flashes forward and backwards from his treatment on Mars to Earth. And I just found it really excellent, and it's sort of another instance of people making a new superhero that is just like from the onset canonically queer and unabashedly about very specific identity, not issues, but intersections, and using superheroes somewhat like familiar stories to alter the story in new, innovative ways. And then the Captain Weird one is so fun because we have no idea about this guy. I don't know how to liken to him in a story, like another superhero story. Yeah, he's a retro guy who is kind of Captain America, where he like goes up in a space mission, a rocket being sent to this like tear in the fabric of the universe. He goes through it. He goes into the parazone. He becomes like a completely different person because he is detached from reality. And so he sees like a pattern in all things, and it starts jumping around in space-time to his story to tell the origin. And sometimes it's like so interesting because it becomes like a Steinbeck origin story, essentially, like very quintessential pastoral America turned on its head, showing sort of the ugliness of people. And then we see all these different instances of events that occurred in the main Black Hammer story rearranged to create the actual pattern that he's always blabbering on about. And so it just sort of reframes his character in the similar way as Barbalian. So it was just a fantastic collection. I would definitely recommend reading Black Hammer Library Edition 1 and 2, or even just 1 specifically, but then go to this one and you'll get so much more out of those characters. Next, I read Oh Beautiful by Jung. This I gave 3 stars. It was a buddy read with Mark Nash. I thought this had a lot of interesting ideas. They send a person representing the standard. She's 36 years old, a Asian American born in North Dakota, I believe it is, and she has roots in the community that she's being sent to. There's a small town that has an oil boom, and she's sent to sort of just like do a piece that shows how the town has altered because of that, and showing the have-nots, in-group, out-groups of that. And her previous professor / ex-boyfriend has sent her there, done all the research, and she just has to like apply all the different research to hit on like a very particular through line to craft an article for the Standard. She's being paid to do it. She's held up at like a fairly nice hotel, but every instance of her interactions on a granular level are more about her noticing how people interact with her. There's very much about racism, about classism, about the influx of money in a town altering its like ecology and dredging up sort of the darkness, the worst parts of humanity, paralleling the racism that was sort of already there. So the unearthing and the fracking of the oil is, allegorical to the town itself. And I live in one of those kind of towns. I've worked in Fort McMurray right by the oil sands. The characters are all very excellent. Dialogue is mostly good. The issue that I have with it is that there are so many things hit on in this book. It's wildly, it's super saturated basically with themes. A particular theme around sexual assault that is meant to sort of work as a capstone, I guess, but it only somewhat works. Every single interaction that she has basically unearths something else or hits on a particular theme. There's lots of microaggressions, lots of sexism, lots of stuff about workplace dynamics that take place, especially the rape culture surrounding people dating professors or being coerced into dating professors or just simply being coerced for like sexual assault. There's just so much trying to be talked about that it does more just raise the questions rather than actually interrogate or examine them. And in the end, all of the interesting plot threads that are brought up end up simply being a way to act, to make the protagonist essentially like a foil for which to examine all these different aspects. And it does a sort of big disservice, I think, to all of those plot threads because they're so thematically steeped and reiterated throughout it. To set them aside for a simple like reintrospection piece, sort of, on the protagonist feels very like solipsistic and very odd in choice, I suppose. Like, on the one hand, it does a very good job of having a emotional character arc for her, but yet every aspect of the actual plot and setting are sacrificed in service to that specific moment. So it's a fine book. There's also some issues with the writing that I had. There's a lot of show don't tell stuff to make it short, but there's a couple copywriting errors too, which is not a big deal, but feels strange because she is a journalist diegetically in it, and some of those errors occur when, again, diegetically she is saying that she is a good writer and being told that she's a good writer, but then when she quotes this very specific person, even in the same page, like the next paragraph, the error occurs there, so she literally didn't copy the person right at the same time, which is strange. So it's sort of a death by 1,000 cuts for this one, but still remains something that I think is interesting, and I'm glad that I consumed. Mark Nash had a lot of similar same thoughts. I'm looking forward to what he has to say about the book in his next weekly wrap-up, but we had some interesting discussions, and we went by 100 pages because it had good flow. We were blowing right through it. So it was a positive experience all around. Next, I read Burnt Sugar, consuming it on audio this time, by Avni Doshi. This is a 4-star read for me. Really great stuff. Very difficult to talk about, but essentially it's about a very tumultuous relationship between mother and daughter, and illustrating the cyclic nature of that relationship and why it continues to be perpetuated. So this is like the most nuanced version of that relationship that I've ever consumed anyway. It's very blunt, it's very honest. The sort of stream of consciousness that occurs makes the character very unlikable, and you're not supposed to like her, nor the mother, but you do come to understand them in great detail, and it makes it fascinating in a but very dark read. There's a lot of stuff around sexual assault, child abuse in various ways, lots of intense stuff being discussed. But the most interesting thing that it does is, again, illustrate that the fear of becoming the parental pattern that you consume when you're a child being reiterated in the next generation, perpetuating itself in a cyclic traumatic cycle, is much more complex than we typically realize. And the way the book goes about educating the reader on this thing, I think, is just completely perfect. It has some flow issues. Sometimes it feels like it has maybe some shock value instances, maybe. But the overall point, and especially the ending, being essentially like a chef's kiss as far as I'm concerned, make this a 4-star read. I think I gave it like 4.25 or something like that on the Storygraph. Next, I consumed Jade Legacy on audio. I put the physical on hold as well, and it was just the first thing that came up. I gave this 4 stars as well. This, I think, has been talked about a lot if you're into SFF anyway, but I really liked this series, and this book, again, was a solid entry. I think I've given all of them 4 stars. The end of this was really great. It goes and zooms out into a macro level, moving across like years and years of their lives. We see how their sort of generation does and does not make an impact on culture, on the actual family, and the final outcome, I guess, between the two feuding families, and kind of like what happens when the island has to open itself up. It made me think about Japan having to open itself up as well, except the technology level in this historical fiction is very strange. Like, I can't really place where it is in history because it's fantasy, But by the end of it, they're talking about like satellite imaging and all of this kind of stuff. So it seems like it's fairly modern after that point. I wish it was much more easier to understand world decisions and world building. I think where this book has always been weakest for me is descriptive writing, specificity, communicating relatable things so I kind of understand just more granularity about the world, because it's so evocative and interesting, but leaves you to generate so much content on yourself that it feels kind of overwhelming sometimes. Kind of like Neil Gaiman doesn't really like to describe things. He wants to be evocative and make people picture things themselves, but he's able to get away with that because he uses such cultural touchstones that it's easy to conjure such images. Kind of results in a defaultism and bland sort of picture in my head. But each other aspect of the story is very strong. The characters are well drawn out. The family drama is exceptional. It's very like people compare it to Godfather for good reason, I think. And the larger sort of way the world works, the way morality and justice are depicted, I think are nuanced and complex. It was a very enjoyable read and a very good finale overall. Next, I read Hellboy Volume 2. I gave this 5 stars. This was fantastic. This is steeped in like a whole bunch of different short stories, so it is a quick read, but it's some of the best work that he's ever done story-wise, so it's very cool because you get them arranged in such a way that you're consuming it in a very linear sort of fashion, whereas if you read it any other way, you wouldn't be getting that. And so there's like allusions to all these different stories that if you had read it in a trade paperback, you wouldn't be aware of unless you got separate trade paperbacks that were just those stories. And so just reading it sort of chronologically really augments everything around it, basically. And it's all about like mythology, occult stuff. There's a lot of like witchy stuff, and just a lot of folklore mythology stuff that he always pulls from that I find fascinating. And I really like his artwork. It's before he allows other people to start drawing Hellboy, so I think it's just the overall best Hellboy thing that I've consumed, and the only one that I've given 5 stars, I think. Next is Memory Keeper by Dawn Cheryl Hill. I give this 4 stars. I think I'm the only one to have rated it on Goodreads. This is an Indigenous author's look at her own past. It's a interrogation of generational ramifications of genocide in Canada, and from a town that she lived in that was like straddling the US-American border as well. So she's sort of has like family that have gone through that kind of thing on both sides of the border, which is wild and sad to say the least. And she kind of uses it as a therapeutic method of meditation to go into these different memories and interrogate her trauma, and by writing it out, sort of achieve a catharsis about it. And she is a social worker, and so it seems like she knows what she's doing. I found the memories very captivating, thematically appropriate, arranged in a very good manner, and all around compelling narrative voice. It does sort of look at, for the layout, kind of like a self-published book, but the back of the book doesn't have one of those pages that would say that it was print on demand, so I'm not really sure how it was produced, and I got it as a gift for Christmas, so I have no idea about it, but I definitely recommend it. And then interestingly, at the end, she has a workbook of different methods that she has used to process trauma, different techniques, and what they're used for. And so that's something I've never seen in a book before, especially a book about these particular themes. I think it is a fantastic inclusion to a book like this. Next, I read the last volume of Die, Volume 4, Bleed, which is the conclusion of the arc, so I don't really want to say too much about it, but this series is about a group of characters that play a tabletop role-playing game in reality, and then when they play it, it sucks them in, kind of like Jumanji. And there they become certain archetypes, different characters, and it recounts what happens within it after they are like returned and obviously like traumatized and haggard and just like radically changed and 20 years older, something like that. And this is sort of like wrapping it up in a very fantastic way. I give it 5 stars, and it has a lot to say about game design, what those type of games are like, quote unquote, for, what to use them for, what they can do, what they're best at doing, while also bookending everybody's sort of journey. It also has like a very queer theme in it. There's a queer character in this that I really love, and their story in it is just like absolutely fantastic. Before, it was just sort of like lightly touched on and it was okay. This one is like, it centers them in such a fantastic way and really brings everything home while paralleling the game theme, so it was just fantastic. Next, I consumed Letters to a Young Poet, a new translation and commentary by Rilke. This I gave 5 stars as well, so it was a good reading week so far. I think everybody is pretty aware of this, but I hadn't consumed it before. In the past, letters were sent to an individual before Rilke died, and this is a reprinting of those letters, translated, of course. There's commentary, which I found very strange because the sort of meat of these things is basically him trying to convey that your art is your own, and introspection and what it means to you is the most important thing versus what other people think about it. And a whole bunch of it spoke to me. I got a lot out of it, but I think you should not be consuming commentary or other people's version of what this means to you. It should be something internalized solely for you, by you. So it's very strange to have that. And then also some of the letters were cut off at some point and removed, and there's commentary at the end at why they did that, but it just feels very strange. Parts where they think that Rilke wouldn't have agreed with now, they've excised from the text, which is questionable at best, I think, but I know nothing about this subject and I don't read much translated works, so I have no idea if this is common practice or what's going on with that. But I would definitely recommend it. It was very excellently written. The flow is exceptional, diction, everything about it is exquisite. Next, I consumed Lemon by Kwan Yo Sun. This is a 4-star read for me. It's, again, not really something you can talk about because it's like the least you know about going into this, the better your experience. It is about a girl who dies, ostensibly murdered, though who knows if that's true. And you get from 3 different perspectives, and I think suspects of in the case, accountings of what they know about the case across many years, I think 20 years. And essentially you need to piece together yourself what may or may not have happened by kind of cross-referencing what each one says and where the white space in each thing that they say is. I thought it was fantastic. It was really engaging, really short, perfect amount of time, great narration. I'll definitely buy it and read it again at some point just to like see if I've kind of figured it out correctly. But it's something you could re-engage with multiple times, consuming very quickly. So I think it's fairly innovative as far as I know, and just a great read. Next, I consumed Axios End by Lindsay Ellis. I gave this 2 stars. It's a first contact story that's very tonally odd. It bounces between serious and funny in ways that it can't pull off. It's very solipsistic. Not even the character feels that well realized. She's sort of nonsensical in her own portrayal. The dialogue is not that great. And the only sort of interesting aspects it has is philosophical underpinnings about intelligent life elsewhere and the philosophical components that would have to the way that we live now and the axioms in which we apply that kind of stuff in a sort of political way. So that part was interesting, but it's not explored very well. And this sort of romance-ish aspect, again, not that great. There's some very weird stuff at the beginning that kind of does come back, but feels very jarring and odd at the start, especially because she's just like, again, not very believable, and it's so sophomoric that you don't feel that the author has you in good hands. And she like at the start, she's implanted with a device that ostensibly takes over her mind, and 2 days later she wakes up and she's like in the midst of doing this alien's bidding, and she's still dressed in like a nightgown and shit like that. But then later on, it's sort of established that if these wanted to, the alien could like teleport her at any given time anywhere or something on Earth, something like that. And so I was like, why would it take her 2 days to get to this place if she could just be teleported and just be doing what her mission was dictating at the time right away, and then never have come back to herself so soon or whatever. There's just a lot of sort of stuff that doesn't really make sense and contradicts itself. Next, I read the next Hellboy book, Volume 3, Conqueror Worm and Strange Places. I gave this 4 stars, and this was the Conqueror Worm I wrote was all right, yeah. And then it kind of got a little bit better with the next one, and it brought it up to 4 stars. But the Conqueror Worm was just sort of like, his artwork was less sophisticated, and there was a lot less dialogue, so it just was like a very quick read that didn't have much to sink into or much to say compared to the former volume with all of the amazing short stories that were thematically appropriate and actually conveying something about Hellboy. This just felt like a fun ride, mostly. But Strange Places did pick up, and so I didn't mind it in the end. Next, I read Dog Island by Philippe Claudel. It is translated by Ewan Cameron from the French. This was an interesting book that was very strange because, so it's a parable being told, but it's interrogating the immigration crisis basically in the Mediterranean, but the voice crafted for it is especially odd, at least to me. Maybe it's common in more French fiction or something, I have no idea, but you're very aware because the person, whoever they are, the voice is specifically setting the scene as like a external person, and then describing certain situations, it flows out of third person into this voice and back again. It's jarring and a little bit odd. Every person or character is an archetype, so doctor, old woman, teacher, stuff, a mayor, stuff like that. And so it puts the onus of what is being done on the entire community, and indeed the issues and the consequences of each action does impact everybody. It is not accountable to only one person for any given action whatsoever. It impacts the entire ecology of the island as well as the community. So it's a small, tiny island, Dog Island. I think they said it was like just a couple hundred people on it. They're very like stuck in the past. They don't have cell phones. They don't have basically any technology, like no internet, stuff like that. They said something about the island makes it so that they can't have it, and there's a volcano on it. 3 dead bodies wash up. 4 of the characters find it. They decide to hide the body, and then things just sort of spiral out from there. And it's interrogating the worst aspects of man, basically, from the foil of each of these different archetypes. What they do when the secret is threatened, what the townspeople do. And again, it's all about accountability and the ramifications of doing nothing as it relates to and parallels to the immigration crisis. So thematic read for sure. It's definitely not for character readers. It's mostly just messaging. Yet I usually hate those books, and I still like this one quite a bit. I give it 4 stars. It's just like odd and off kilter enough to make it interesting and not just like beating your head over with like a message like Midnight Library. So it definitely won't be for everybody, but it is a short read. The flow is great, the writing is great, and it obviously had something to say that was worth saying, at least in my opinion. So next is Zadie Smith's Intimations. I gave this 3 stars, and I think if I had consumed it when it first came out with the pandemic, because it's such a like microcosm and a bubble of what was happening specifically in that time, it would have been more interesting. But all of these things are sort of stuff that people have already discussed, and it's also kind of Anthropocene reviewed. Let me tell you about every single granular thought that I had, and some of which you will care about, others you won't. Though it is much more of a social justice bent, and maybe reiterating the ways in which the pandemic is hitting marginalized people. So there's at least a through line there, but there's definitely some detritus that could have been jettisoned, and I would have been perfectly fine. I gave it 3 stars. Next is Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness by Catherine Cho. This is another 3-star read. I thought it was just fine because the structure undermines sort of what the book is actually trying to convey sometimes. It sets up with her being already institutionalized for postpartum psychosis, and then it regresses into her childhood, her memories, her trauma, and then the trajectory of her having an actual break and what happens. And in that way, it manages to convey some pretty important factors for cultural things, especially around child rearing in Korea specifically, or Korean diasporic families, stuff like that, because she is in England and America in this book, not specifically Korea, I think. And so that aspect is really great, but she sets up at the beginning, and I won't give it away, something very specific to it that is proved to be incorrect later, which really made me kind of question why structurally it was done that way, because it didn't need to be. Yet the childhood stuff and the trajectory made a lot of sense, so it just felt incongruent in that way. The writing was just fine. Obviously there's some triggering stuff for some people around mental health, around child abuse, and things that would go intersectional with those two things. I think that's about all I had to say on it. I still found it worth reading and would recommend people to read it, with the caveat that the stylistic choice and structure undermines it somewhat. Next, I read Hellboy Volume 4, The Crooked Man and the Troll Witch. This I gave 3 stars. I thought it was fine. It's still delving into the stuff I like about Hellboy with the occult and mythological stuff, but other people draw Hellboy in this one, and it's not that great for me. I think one artist was better, and then the other 2 were worse, and it is a little bit jarring to experience. The Crooked Man was fine, if I remember, or no, Troll Witch was just fine. Crooked Man I thought was somewhat interesting and quite dark, but overall it was just, yeah, again, kind of fine. It petered out. There wasn't a like standout excellent arc, basically. Next, I read The Deep by River Solomon. It was on audio. I thought this was a fantastic use of allegory and metaphor for very like complex Black cultural predominantly issues. It compartmentalizes things in very smart ways to kind of allow the reader to get a bite-sized or compartmentalized relationship with one aspect before introducing a different thing. and then still manages to draw a parallel with identity of the very specific character. Things around history, genetic trauma, or generational traumas, I should say, sorry. Generational memory, and diasporic instances where things are both altered and the same from those peoples. And the story itself does take like a bit of a weird, jarring turn at one point, but in service to the themes, I think. And so it did feel still cohesive enough that I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars. It kept shifting between 3 and 4 stars, but I landed on 4, going up from 3.5. Also very well narrated and a short read. And then I finished with For Joshua, an Ojibwe Father Teaches His Son by Richard Wagamese. And this was a 4-star read. It's quite sentimental like some of his other stuff, but because there's this through line where he is trying to impart this generational knowledge to his son that he himself accrues throughout the journey, because it is a memoir, almost a biography, not quite. It is very impactful, I think, because he imparts these mythological and legends of his people that sort of parallel his own path as a young person who was ripped away from his family, and how he reacted to that, why he was an alcoholic for a time, and sort of the lost listlessness that people have in the Ojibwe stories that he tells, and how they come back to nature, was just sort of like a perfect parallel and bookend to the book. So I thought it was excellent, and he narrates it pretty well for being the author. So, and that's it. That's every book that I read. If you've read any of these, feel free to comment and tell me what you thought. And otherwise, I will see you next video. Bye.